Greetings. Okay, just making sure everything looks good with the camera. And very good. Get the video in front of me. Fabulous. YouTube. Okay. Sorry I have to do these things after I've started the video because I can't get the video in front of me until it's streaming. Okay. Very good. Who's in the house? Stephen Giger and Shoshana Rivka have joined. Yehudit Sobel from Florence, South Carolina. Great to see you. Stephen is in New Hampshire. Sharon Frant Brooks says Erev Tov from Lebanon, New Jersey. Leona Sue Thacker is in the house. Marianne Baddeley says greetings from Market Drayton, United Kingdom. Great to have you with us. I was just watching a presentation hosted by the Tikva Society. Very interesting group. Puts on very high-level, sort of intellectual presentations. They also host a program for high school students at Yale every summer. And today's presentation was a talk with David Petraeus, the former four-star general and director of the CIA. He talked about various aspects of the pandemic and the response and other matters of world importance and security. I'm not going to describe his whole talk. You can find it on the Tikva, the Tikva group or the Tikva Society, Tikva, Tikvah on Facebook. They were live. But the takeaway that I liked, that I enjoyed at the very end from his talk, is that he sees himself as a rational optimist, that it is appropriate to be optimistic about our future if one is a rational person. I think he was talking about American ingenuity, capability, morality. We're a nation and a world that is going to work hard to see us through this pandemic. And I would just add that as a person of faith, I think even more it is rational to be optimistic about our future. I think we've got challenges now. They're important challenges. They're with us for a reason. They're with us for a while, but they challenge us to step up, to care for each other, to come up with solutions. And I think people are doing that. I mean, every day we hear great stories from the front lines, doctors and other people involved in first response and essential services, stepping up and doing for each other, not just at that, that high and heroic level, but even in our neighborhoods, people helping each other. And I think these are all causes for rational optimism. How are you, my holy brothers and sisters? We are holding on Daf Ayin Gimel, page 73 of Tractate Shabbos, the second volume of the Talmud. We're in chapter 7, which explores the essence of Shabbos and what happens if one forgets that it's Shabbos or forgets that things are prohibited. That was really the essence of the first Mishnah here in chapter 7. Today we're going to wrap up the commentary on Mishnah number 1 and begin Mishnah number 2 and its commentary. So let's get into it. In wrapping up the first Mishnah of chapter 7, we were looking yesterday at the difference between Abaye and Rava, between the Amoraim, Abaye and Rava, who were based in Babylonia. And they were good friends and had a lot of love for each other, but when they disagreed passionately and brought their proofs. So in looking at the difference between Rava and Abaye, particularly we're looking at liability for one who violates Shabbos in an unwitting fashion. Recall that the Mishnah looks at 3 cases of violating Shabbos unwittingly. The first is a person who doesn't even know what Shabbos is, or that it applies to Jews. The second is a person who knows what Shabbos is. He knows that a Jew is bound by the Torah not to do work on Shabbos, but he didn't know that it was Shabbos. Somehow he lost track of the calendar. And the third case was somebody who knows what Shabbos is and that it applies to Jews. He knew that it was Shabbos, but he was not aware of the laws of Shabbos, and so he violated some prohibitions. He did a work that was prohibited by the Torah, some kinds of work, because he didn't know. He just didn't know that it was prohibited. And we saw also there was a difference between Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish on what not knowing about a law, what not knowing what kinds of work are prohibited. Rabbi Yochanan said it's enough to know, even if you knew that it was prohibited, but you didn't know what the punishment was, that it was a severe prohibition. And Reish Lakish says, no, in order for you to be unwittingly violating a prohibited law of Shabbos, it's enough you need to know, you need to not know that that kind of work is prohibited. It is not enough to know that it is not enough that you are ignorant of the punishment for doing that kind of labor. So that's where we were. That's the Mishnah that we're discussing. And finishing up the difference between Rava and Abaye, we were looking at certain kinds of mistakes. Yesterday we were discussing at the end of the day the case of somebody who reaches down to pick up for some detached plants, right? You can't reap on Shabbos, as we'll see. So you can't harvest. You can't take a plant that's growing out of the ground and cut it from the ground and bring it into your home. Like you can't pick a head of lettuce out of the ground and then eat it, because then you would be performing the prohibited labor of reaping on Shabbos. But if plants had already been detached from the ground and they were simply lying there, and then you were just picking it up and bringing it inside to eat, that would be permitted. The problem is you bent down to pick up some detached plants, and by mistake, you grabbed in that bundle a plant that was still attached to the ground and detached it. So then the question is, are you liable to bring a sin offering for this unwitting violation? If you did it on purpose, that's something else. Then the punishment is excision at the hands of heaven. But if you did it unwittingly, you didn't mean to do it, we saw in the case of, you didn't know that it was Shabbos, or you didn't know what Shabbos was, or you didn't know that it is prohibited to reap, and you did these things, you would have to bring a sin offering. But here, where you only intended to do something that was permitted, which is just to pick up some plants, and not with no intention at all, you gathered a plant that was still attached to the ground, both Rava and Abaye would agree that you are not liable. You are exempt from bringing a sin offering because the action that you intended to do had nothing of a prohibited nature, and it was just a sheer accident that you also happened to grab some plants that were still attached to the ground. However, if you took a scissors and you went and you intended to cut some plants that were already detached from the ground, that would be permitted. But by accident, you cut a plant that was attached to the ground, Rava would still say you are exempt, you didn't do anything wrong. And Abaye would say you are liable because the act of cutting has something of a prohibited nature to it. You are permitted to cut plants that are already detached from the ground, but it was an intentional act of cutting that resulted in this accidental cutting of something that was already that was still attached to the ground. And so per Abaye, you would be liable to bring a sin offering. The halacha, the law, follows Rava. So in this, the sages were lenient and they follow the opinion of Rava, and you are exempt in this case of the accident, whether you meant to grab a bunch of detached plants or you meant to cut detached plants. In either case, if you happen to also sever a plant that was attached to the ground, you would be exempt. And to understand how, the scope of this difference between Rava and Abaye, so now we bring a couple of more cases. There's this situation, and by the way, what is Abaye's reasoning? He's looking at the case of eating forbidden food, right? So if you, and I think we discussed a little bit yesterday, if you intended to swallow something that was permitted, but by accident you swallowed chelev, which is a forbidden fat. It's a part of the animal that is forbidden for a Jew to eat. You meant to swallow something that was permitted. By accident, you swallowed something that was prohibited. You would be liable to bring a sin offering. And by the way, if you're joining us for the first time today, please understand that we're studying this liability to bring sin offerings. Nobody has been liable to bring a sin offering for 2,000 years because we haven't had a temple. And in the absence of a temple, you can't bring a sin offering. Instead, you would go through a process of atonement and prayer, perhaps giving to tzedakah, and that is how you go through an atonement process during this period of the exile when we don't have a temple and cannot bring a sin offering. However, sages have always said that when we don't have a temple and we can't bring offerings, studying the offering also substitutes for bringing them. Okay? So in the case, interestingly, that in the case of the forbidden food, even though you had no intent to eat something forbidden, you did it by accident, you would be liable to bring a sin offering. And both Rava and Abaye agree on that. So Abaye says, well, just like in the forbidden food, similar to the case of Shabbos. But Rava and the sages demonstrate that Shabbos, the prohibitions of Shabbos, are not like other prohibitions. And we don't have this strict liability for doing something. If you had no intent to violate a prohibition that attends to Shabbos, you're not going to be liable to bring the sin offering. And likewise, let me just get this other case here. The permitted food. So the case, and likewise, so they have the case of somebody who intended to throw an object 2 cubits in the public domain. Recall that in terms of the law of carrying on Shabbos, you are not permitted to carry something in the public domain more than 4 cubits. What's a cubit? About like from the elbow to the tip of my finger, about 1.5 feet. And in Hebrew, an amma, or plural amos, right? So you can't carry something 4 amos in the public domain. If you throw something more than that distance, it is considered the equivalent of carrying it, since you caused it to be moved that far. Now, that minimum measure is 4 cubits. So if you intended to throw something 2 cubits, okay, so that's less than the minimum measure to be liable for violating that prohibition. So you would be exempt from bringing a sin offering. But you intended to throw it 2 cubits, and by mistake, you threw it 4 cubits. Abaye says you're liable to bring the sin offering. Rava says you're not. You didn't intend to violate Shabbos. You didn't do a thing that would normally cause that, certainly not by your intent, and so you're exempt. And again, the law follows Rava. So you didn't intend to violate Shabbos. You meant to throw it 2 cubits. It went 4 cubits. You violated Shabbos, but you are exempt from bringing a sin offering for it. And likewise, the case of somebody who meant to carry something 4 cubits in a private domain, which is permitted, and by mistake it turned out that he was in the public domain. Again, Rava says you're exempt, Abaye says you're liable, and the law follows Rava. So we, over and over again, we see that a person, you're going to be penalized for having an intent and then violating Shabbos, or an intent to do an activity that would violate Shabbos, but only then, right? So if you're intending to do something that wouldn't be a violation of Shabbos, you're not going to become liable to the sin offering. And interestingly, the halacha also says, even if one had the intention to perform a prohibited action on Shabbos and ultimately performed a different prohibited action, he is exempt from bringing a sin offering, right? So you really have to intend to do a thing which is prohibited. It's not intentional in case you didn't know that that thing was prohibited. But if you intend to do something different than the violation which resulted, So you're not going to be liable to bring the sin offering. Okay. And that wraps up our discussion of the first Mishnah. Now we come to the second Mishnah, and this is a very important, well-known Mishnah in the Talmud. The second Mishnah of chapter 7 here in Masechet Shabbos, Tractate Shabbos, lists the 39 forbidden labors of Shabbos, right? So we've been talking about all these different labors that you're not allowed to do on Shabbos. We've been just implying that we know what they are. We've mentioned some examples like kindling a fire or extinguishing a fire, like carrying, like detaching plants from the ground. Well, what are the forbidden labors of Shabbos? And here in this second Mishnah of chapter 7, we're finally going to encounter the list. So let me read you the list. These are the 39 activities which you are not allowed to do on Shabbos. And they are derived from the categories of work that were necessary when the children of Israel were in the desert and we were building the tabernacle. See, these were all categories of labor that in some way contributed to the construction of the tabernacle. The first version of the Holy Temple, the portable Holy Temple, if you will, that went with us in our travels through the desert, went into the Promised Land with us, and remained the center of worship for another 400 years until King David gathered picked a place and gathered the materials to build the temple, began the process, and it would be his son, King Solomon, who would actually build the first temple. Okay, what are the forbidden labors of Shabbos? The fundamental Mishnah enumerates those who perform the primary categories of labor prohibited on Shabbat, which number 40 less 1. Instead of saying 39, it says 40 less 1, right? 40 minus 1. They are grouped in accordance with their function. The first group, one who sows and one who plows, right? So sow, S-O-W, one who puts seeds into the ground, and one who plows, one who reaps, and one who gathers sheaves into a pile, one who threshes, removing the kernel from the husk, and one who winnows threshed grain in the wind, and one who selects the inedible waste from the edible, and one who grinds, and one who sifts the flour in a sieve, and one who kneads dough, and one who bakes. What does baking and kneading dough have to do with the tabernacle? Because there was a table inside the tabernacle near the altar on which the showbreads would sit all from Shabbos to Shabbos, right? And they would miraculously stay warm and fresh all week. But there were 12 loaves of bread that were always on display in the temple on the table of the showbreads. And so, in order to have the fresh bread, kneading and baking and all of the steps of creating bread are part of the work of the Mishkan. Second paragraph. Additional primary categories of prohibited labor are the following: one who shears wool and one who whitens it, and one who combs the fleece and straightens it, and one who dyes it, and one who spins the wool, and one who stretches the threads of the warp in the loom, and one who constructs 2 meshes, tying the threads of the warp to the base of the loom, and one who weaves 2 threads, and one who severs 2 threads for constructive purposes, and one who ties a knot, and one who unties a knot, and one who sews 2 stitches with a needle, as well as one who tears a fabric in order to sew 2 stitches. So that paragraph was all about creating the fabrics of the Mishkan, right? So this was like, harvesting either the wool from a sheep, or we talked already in the first paragraph about harvesting, so getting linen and those kinds of materials. And then what you do with these threads, that you put them on, you would string them on a loom, and then you would interweave them, and then, on the loom, you would create large fabrics, and then you would dye the fabrics and cut the fabrics and sew the fabrics, etc. All of that kind of labor was used in the tabernacle and is forbidden on Shabbos. The third paragraph, one who traps a deer or any living creature, and one who slaughters it. and one who flays it, and one who salts its hide, a step in the tanning process, and one who tans its hide, and one who smooths it, removing hairs and veins, and one who cuts it into measured parts. Right? So that paragraph was all about using hides in the tabernacle, and indeed there was a layer covering the whole tabernacle of ram skins and tachash skins, an animal which we've never seen in the modern world. It was already extinct at the time that the tabernacle was built, but that they had enough skins available to use it to cover the tabernacle. And one who writes 2 letters, and one who erases in order to write 2 letters, one who builds a structure, and one who dismantles it, one who builds a structure. That's going to be all the kinds of labor that are involved in construction: hammering, sawing, drilling, etc. All those types of activities come under one who builds a structure, and one who dismantles it. And we've said several times already, for constructive purposes. All of these labors are going to be forbidden because they lead to something constructive. And as anyone who has worked on a house knows, sometimes you have to demolish a structure in order to build a new one. In that case, the destructive action of demoing a structure so you can build a new one, the demolition is constructive. But if all you did was destroy, not with the purpose of replacing or starting over in some way leading in a constructive process, then that would be different. Destruction that's not constructive is differentiated here in the Talmud from destruction that leads to constructive purposes. And finally, one who extinguishes a fire, and one who kindles a fire, one who strikes the final blow. So whatever is necessary in order to finish creating an object. The final step is its own category. And one, this is the last one, the 39th labor listed. The first one we started talking about in Tractate Shabbos. And one who carries out an object from domain to domain, from public domain to private domain, or private domain to public domain. All these primary categories of labor, all these are the primary categories of labor, and they number 40 less 1. All right, so now we have learned the list. What are the forbidden labors of Shabbos? Why do we need the number? Why? It tells us twice, at the beginning and at the end, that they are 40 less 1. And we need to know the tally in case somehow a person violated every labor on Shabbos, not knowing it was Shabbos. No, I'm saying he knew it was Shabbos, but he didn't know that it was forbidden to do these labors on Shabbos. And so then he would be liable to bring a sin offering for every category of labor. If he hammered 100 nails, in fact, if he built a whole house, he'd only be liable to 1 sin offering. But if he built a house and he signed his name on a check and he baked some bread all on one Shabbos, so then there would be 3 violations, right? And he'd be liable to 3. He violated 3 categories, and he would be liable to bring 3 sin offerings. At the beginning of this list, the first labors that are mentioned are sowing and plowing. One who sows and one who plows. Now, for most of us who grew up in a suburb or in a city and not on a farm, we just hear that and like, okay. But anybody who grew up on a farm would say, wait, what did you say? Right? Because the list says one who sows and one who plows. And a person who grew up on a farm would say, well, first you plow and then you sow, right? First you dig a hole in the ground and then you put the seeds into it. Why does the Mishnah say one who sows and one who plows in that order? Now, you could say, well, it just happened that way. This is the Talmud. Nothing ends up in here by accident. So we definitely want to think about why is it in that order. And in fact, the Gemara on this Mishnah begins by asking that question. So the rabbis of the later period than the Mishnah are saying, why did they say sow before plow? The first answer given is, as a practical matter. here in Babylonia, where we're discussing it, we plow and then we sow. But in Israel, for some reason, they would sow and then plow. Some said, well, they would plow and then they would sow and then they would plow again to cover the seeds with earth. And that's why it says sow and then plow. Or some would say, well, they would just spread the seed and then come along and plow the ground so that the seed would go into the ground and not just lie on top of it. That's the practical dimension of this teaching. I would like to suggest that there's a spiritual dimension to this. What does it mean to sow and then plow? I feel like that's what we do when we're out there doing kiruv. Kiruv means bringing people closer to God. It doesn't mean evangelizing. It just means making these teachings available to people, right? I'm not telling you what you should believe and what you should do, but I want to put the information before you. So here I am on Facebook and spreading these seeds far and wide. Where will they take root? I don't know. I can't tell. But by sharing it with a large number of people, I know that it's likely that some people will be very interested in these teachings and they will dig into it. And then those seeds will take root. That's my example of sharing Jewish wisdom with a large audience on Facebook. But I think this applies to everybody. And not just with matters of faith, but if you think about matters of wisdom. Some people are interested in wisdom and some are not. Some people are interested in wisdom at times when they have, let's say, they're not stressed and they have the space with which to pursue wisdom and they're not busy, earning a living or handling emergencies, etc. And other times they are handling those emergencies, they are busy and it's not for them. And you never know who you're talking to and what their openness to having a deep philosophical conversation is. But if these things interest you and if you think that wisdom is worth passing on, so don't worry about it that some people won't be interested in it. Make it available to people. Offer to have conversations about deeper topics. I have found in my life, long before I was the accidental Talmudist, that there's a lot of people who are interested in deeper conversations than just what's in the news and what the sports teams are doing, etc. I mean, I'm interested in the news, I'm interested in sports, but I'm also interested in having deeper conversations with people and finding out what are the important lessons they've learned and sharing what I've learned. And it's amazing how often you can go from a casual, hey, how you doing, type of conversation, even with a stranger, to, saying something like, I heard something amazing today. And they say, well, what'd you hear? With a stranger. And then you get into a conversation, and it's amazing where these kind of conversations can go. And I think that that is what our sages are teaching us when they say sowing before plowing. Right? You could just put the seeds out there, and you might be surprised where they'll take root. And then you and your conversation partner can dig in a little bit deeper. I also recall when I was once interviewing Rabbi Aden Steinsaltz, who is the editor, Rabbi Aden Evan Steinsaltz, who is the editor of this vast commentary on the Talmud that I've been using as I teach you. And I was telling him my story, which you've heard before in other places, how I happened to buy book 1 of the Talmud on day 1 of the Daf Yomi cycle. But that in the midst of that story, that when I took my book to the counter to buy it, and the gentleman at the counter, Zach Plotzker, said, oh, you're doing Daf Yomi? And I said, what's Daf Yomi? And he looked at me funny. And as I was telling this story to Rabbi Steinsaltz, I said, and I felt like such an idiot. And his answer to me is very blunt and kind of hilarious. But what he said to me was, he said, no, worse than an idiot. Among Jews, an ignoramus is worse than an idiot. And it's true. There is such a value placed within Judaism on education. being dumb, not your fault. Whatever brain capacity you have, that's what God gave you, and you should be proud of it, right? But how much you've learned and how much you've studied, that's in your control. And a person who allows himself to remain ignorant on any issue where he had an opportunity to learn and wasted it, where he had an opportunity to learn and chose not to, that's something our sages look down on. An ignoramus is worse than an idiot. An idiot is an idiot. And even a very smart person, might be considered an idiot by somebody else who's just brighter or whatever. Just somebody who's rude and arrogant might look at somebody else and say they're an idiot. There's no place for that. You are who you are. But to be an ignoramus, it's not good. It's not good. You're not an ignoramus because you're here with me putting in the time and effort to learn something new. Sowing, then plowing. Okay, where are my notes? That's the spiritual dimension of sowing and plowing. The final thing I'll say for today about our page, Daf Ayin Gimel, page 73, is that some of these categories, there are certain actions that we can do, which if we did on Shabbos, would not only be prohibited, but they would lead one action to being liable to bring 2 or more sin offerings. How is this possible? Because, for example, if you had bushes in front of your house that needed pruning, right? So, they need pruning, and you should know that according to what the Talmud says, and I think any gardener or farmer would agree, that when you prune a plant, it actually stimulates growth in other parts of the plant, right? Because now the energy and the water and the nutrients inside the plant can focus on the places where you want it to grow. So if you prune a plant, that is a prohibited labor, and it is in fact equivalent to planting. So it's actually like taking, if you take a bulb, just a sprout, some kind of a sprout, and you put it in the ground, it's different than sowing. Sowing is when you put seeds in the ground. Planting is when you put a plant in the ground, right? But pruning is considered like planting because it stimulates growth in the plant, just as putting that plant in the ground would stimulate its growth. And if, when you prune the bushes in front of your house, you keep the cuttings that you're going to use for kindling the next time you need to start a fire in your fireplace. So then it wasn't, destructive in the sense of just throwing those cuttings away. You were actually making cuttings that you could use. It's kindling, right? Kindling for your fireplace. So you would have violated reaping as well. So the one action of pruning the bush potentially is going to make you liable for bringing 3 sin offerings, for planting, for 2 sin offerings, because pruning is planting, right? So pruning comes out like planting. Pruning itself, I don't think, is a separate category. I'm pretty sure. No. So the pruning of the bush would make you liable to 2 sin offerings if you were going to use the cuttings as kindling later, because that same action would result in both planting, as it were, stimulating growth in the plant, and reaping, gathering those cuttings that would have utility for you. Now, we could think of this as, oh man, the Talmud, the sages are being so strict. They're gonna condemn us. They're gonna find us liable, and now we have to bring 2 sin offerings when the temple stands again. But actually, this is a lesson in working smarter, not harder, right? If you can design in your life during the 6 days of the week, right, when it is permitted to do these things, it's prompting us to think, how can we work smarter, not harder? And we see this all the time today. This is good ecological thinking, right? If we need to prune our bushes, and the stuff that we're going to cut from the bushes, instead of just throwing it away and taking it to a landfill, which would be terrible, at the very least, maybe we could put it in a compost pile that would end up becoming soil that we could use later for farming, or we could use those cuttings, as kindling for a fireplace. Anytime we can take the fruit of our labor and apply it both to the thing that we're doing and to something else, that's working smarter, not harder. And the last little teaching for today, again, has to do with intent. Let's say you dig a hole in the ground. So digging for the purpose of creating a site where you're going to build something, like digging a foundation for a house, right? Digging out the place where you're going to later pour the concrete and build a house over it. So that digging has a constructive purpose, and it is part of the category of construction, and therefore it would make you liable to bring a sin offering. However, if there was some filth, and especially in those days people had dirt floors, so if there was some filth on the ground and you wanted to take some dirt, from one part of your dirt floor, pick it up, scoop it out, and use it to cover that filth somewhere else on your dirt floor, so then you would not have violated the Torah's prohibition on construction and its subcategory of digging, because you didn't do it for a constructive purpose. In fact, it was destructive because you had a smooth floor before, and now you dug out some dirt. And so what this was you did a labor not for its own sake. Normally digging, why do you do it? You do it as part of a construction project, or perhaps you're plowing and it's part of farming. But where you're just going to destroy some of your floor because you need the dirt in order to cover some filth, then you did not violate that prohibition at all, and you would not become liable to bring a sin offering. Okay, that's what I've got for us today. Let me check the comments and see if there's any questions or something I can help out people who are wondering. Let's see. Lynn says, how is it in chapter 7 that Abaye says one can be liable for a sin offering if the infraction was intended? Was it not the rule that there is no offering allowed for intentional sins? And here what we're talking about is degrees of intention. Abaye would agree that if you intended to violate Shabbos, no, the penalty for that is karas. What he's saying is you intended to cut some detached plants, you happen to cut some attached plants. So it is an unwitting sin, but it's unwitting with an intent to do something, whereas Rava would say it was completely unwitting, or he would call it unaware, right? You had no idea you were going to do something that was prohibited. I think the real difference between Rava and Abaye, it doesn't say this in the book, but I think what really is between them is that Abaye is saying you need to be careful when you're doing something that might lead you to violate Shabbos in some way. And we're gonna hold you liable, even though it wasn't your intent to violate Shabbos, but you did something that was, it could have reasonably been foreseen that you might violate Shabbos. And I think this is similar to the dispute between Rav Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon, right? So Rav Yehuda says that if you move a bench over your dirt floor and you create a furrow in the ground, which is like plowing, okay, you only wanted to move the bench, but it was foreseeable that you might create the furrow, and so you're liable to bring a sin offering for plowing on Shabbos. But Rabbi Shimon would say, you only wanted to move the bench. It was not inevitable that you were going to create a furrow. You might have moved that bench without creating a furrow. The furrow was the unintended consequence of a permitted labor, and therefore you're not liable, right? So Rabbi Shimon is similar to Rava, and Abaye is similar to Rav Yehuda. One is being more lenient, one is being more stringent. And I think underlying the philosophy of the stringent opinion is you didn't mean to do anything wrong, but you probably should have been more careful. And that's why they're going to hold you responsible. Whereas the lenient opinions are saying it's a big deal to make somebody liable to bring a sin offering. Yes, it's an opportunity to go through an atonement process, but we're not going to force somebody to do that when they really had no intention to do anything wrong. And somebody who wants to go through that process, there's other offerings that he can bring. We don't have to make him liable to bring the sin offering. Let's see, there was a longer comment here. Leona Suthacker says, my dad used to say ignorance is no excuse when there's so many people to answer the questions that you ask. Ignorance is curable through education, but idiocy is a lifelong affliction. Yeah, exactly. I think that's what these guys are saying. You could have become educated, you could have learned, you could ask a question. So ask, be more careful, take it more seriously. Melissa says, watering a plant or changing the water of a bouquet, no matter how dry the soil, is likewise prohibited on Shabbos. That's correct. Brandon Christian Sullivan says, if one didn't bring a sin offering, what spiritual state would they have remained in? What a good question. So if you're liable to bring the sin offering, and let's remember that it's a big deal. It's a big deal, right? Because, if you happen to live in Jerusalem and you were a wealthy person who could, afford whatever was necessary to bring the sin offering, and for the various offerings, it was generally sort of the rich man's sacrifice and the poor man's sacrifice, and the Torah would make it possible for even the poorest person to go through the process. But still, he had to get to Jerusalem, right? So somebody who lived, a week's journey, for him, has to walk to Jerusalem. It's going to take him a week to get there. So that's not such an easy thing to do. And so I think for most people, they were only going to get to Jerusalem, ideally 3 times a year for the festivals, but probably some people couldn't even do that. So they would just sort of, keep that tally of, okay, I owe a sin offering, I'll bring it when I can. And, a person who's liable to bring the sin offering, it's not like they're going to be somehow quarantined or excommunicated from society. It's not like the person who has tzara'as, who needs purification before he can rejoin society. You're just liable to bring the sin offering. And we had the case very early in this tractate of Rabbi Yehoshua, right, who said, okay, well, we're not allowed to touch the Shabbos lamp. We're not allowed to read by the Shabbos lamp. That's a rabbinic decree, because we might come to unthinkingly move the Shabbos lamp, and then that might cause it to be extinguished a little sooner. And so it's an act of extinguishing a fire. So the rabbis protect us from accidentally doing that. And that we don't. If you move a Shabbos lamp, an oil lamp, so then that's a Torah. You violate a Torah prohibition. Reading by the Shabbos lamp is only a rabbinic prohibition. If you read by it and don't touch the Shabbos lamp, you're not liable to bring anything. You just violated a rabbinic prohibition, which you should not do. But Rabbi Yehoshua said, okay, well, I'm a sage. I'm really well educated. This rabbinic decree was to protect the simple people who would forget that it's Shabbos and they would come to move the Shabbos lamp. He had to, give a lecture the next day to a lot of people. He was going to teach Torah. It was very important, very holy work. He wanted to make sure that he was ready. Let's say that was the background of the story. And so he starts reading by the Shabbos lamp. He gets really absorbed in what he's reading. And without thinking about it, he moved the Shabbos lamp and violated the Torah prohibition. So his comment about that story is, how wise are the words of the sages? I, Yehoshua, read by the lamp, and I adjusted the wick, and when the temple is rebuilt, I will bring a fatted sin offering. Right? So to answer your question, Brandon, Rabbi Yehoshua was in that same state, liable to bring a sin offering, unable to bring it because he lived in a time after the temple was destroyed. And so, you wait until the next chance you have. It's funny because Judaism is often associated, right, with the guilty, like the guilt complex that a Jewish mom gives you. But actually, though we have sin offerings and guilt offerings, and we study very carefully whether someone is liable to bring an offering or is not liable to bring an offering, we do not wallow in guilt. We do not wallow in regret. We just ascertain, are we liable to bring the offering? Yes, we are. Okay, I know that I need to bring a sin offering the next chance I get. Perhaps when the Messiah comes and the third temple is brought, then I will be able to bring the sin offering. In the absence of that, I can't bring a sin offering, but I do want to go through a good process of atonement. And, if, for example, one is praying or one forgets to pray the morning prayer. So then in the afternoon prayer, he can say an extra Amidah. He makes the afternoon Amidah, then he says something else like a psalm or the Aleinu, and then he says another Amidah to make up for the morning, right? So there's an opportunity to make up for what you missed. You take the opportunity and you move on. You don't, now when you take that opportunity to do the extra Amidah, you are supposed to reflect, hey, Why did I miss the morning prayer today? Because I was in a hurry, because I didn't prioritize my relationship with God. I prioritized, reading the paper or making a business call or, whatever I did. I procrastinated. I need to think about what led that to happen and resolve not to do it again. And that's it, right? Then you make up for it and you move on. We don't wallow in guilt. We do try to refine our behavior so that whatever led to the transgression in the first place won't happen again. That is what I have got for us today. Abraham Sosa says, how soon do you have to bring a sin offering once you become liable? I don't think there's not a time limit for that. The next time that it becomes possible for you to do it, and that's loosely defined. And like I said, since we don't have a temple, it's going to wait until the third temple comes. All right, my friends, it's great to be learning with you in the afternoon here, or the evening that is drawing upon us in LA. And with God's help, we'll meet again tomorrow around the same time, maybe a little earlier. I'm going to try to get on the air about 5 o'clock Pacific tomorrow. And then we can continue our learning. Until then, I wish you God's blessing in the evening, and may all your worthy desires be granted.